Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. The European Union, as expected, has now launched legal proceedings against the United Kingdom over it walking away for some parts of the Brexit deal, which it had reached with the EU. As we know, that's also meant to come into play by the end of this year. There has now been a squabble, though, about legislation that has passed in the House of Commons there in the United Kingdom about, again, a part of the deal that has to do with specifically the border, the hard border versus soft border when it comes to Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And that, of course, has created controversy from day one when it comes to the Brexit issue altogether anyhow. So now the EU has sent a letter, a formal notice, essentially, to the UK, and will then wait for the UK's response. This is the first step, as the EU normally takes in such disputes as well. How significant is this? Let's discuss all of this a bit further with our guest, who is joining us now from Messina in Italy, is Dr. Daniela Irrera, who is an associate professor of political sciences and international relations. She's also the deputy head for research and internationalization at the Università di Catania. Daniela, thank you very much for your time today. How significant, Daniela, is it that the European Union has taken this step? It was to be expected?
Hi, thank you very much for inviting me. Just let me say that it is absolutely important for the EU to have things done in a proper way. This is the first time that a phenomenon like Brexit is happening today. And I think that what is important for the EU is that nothing happens that can be used in the later step, and that all things are done according to international and European law. But at the same time, it is absolutely sensitive for both parts, and particularly for Northern Ireland. So it can a little bit understandable what is happening in the UK debate. What is important from the point of view of the EU is that all international law principles and norms are respected, and everything happens accordingly.
Right. So do you think that this is going to escalate more? I mean, does this mean, as the pessimists would say, that there is no possible deal then between the EU and the UK on Brexit? And I'm talking specifically, of course, about a trade deal as well.
Well, the worst scenario would be obviously a no deal outcome, which is something that no one, of course, would like to do that. But I would not be so pessimistic, because if we look at the history of relations between the EU and the UK, we have always experienced several attempts to negotiate, to find solutions which could make the UK governments, different governments, more comfortable. And I think it's in the interest of the EU to not break any law and any norms, and to do everything accordingly. But at the same time, it's also in the interest of the EU to find a solution which can also accommodate the UK preferences. So of course, all the trade aspects are absolutely important, but I would not underestimate the political impact of the border, the existence of the border, because the conflict is still in a very hybrid condition, and also there's a problem of respecting what is provided by the Good Friday Agreement, which is absolutely relevant for the EU itself. Also, it's in the interest of the EU to continue to let all the Good Friday Agreement provisions continue. So, at the end of the day, I would think that the negotiation perspective will prevail, and that a no deal outcome will be avoided.
You know, when it comes to the entire border issue, right, the Good Friday Agreement, the border that has so far existed between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, for a lot of us, you know, from the outside in, that's a very confusing setup, right? Because there's the issue of the border, sovereignty, et cetera, and now, of course, with Brexit occurring. In your opinion, do you think that in the deal that had already been reached so far between the two sides, i.e. the EU and the UK, that was the best possible solution to that issue?
The so-called Northern Ireland Protocol was considered not probably as the best solution for everyone, but one of the most, the closest protocol to the best solution, and it was the final result of a long negotiation, and in the end, it was something that the EU was considering as the final point for negotiating the last part of the Brexit, the last step of the Brexit. So it's not actually the best solution, because it was an attempt to find a balance between the provisions by Brexit, which are unavoidable, but at the same time, once again, what is provided by the Good Friday Agreement. So the point is that a hard border, the maintenance of a hard border between Northern Ireland and the rest of Ireland, which right now has a new meaning, which means the UK and the rest of the European Union, has a very important political meaning. And it is true that, of course, it can produce a more escalation of violence, or there are still several fringe groups there. But it's not only a problem of violence, it's also a problem of investments made on the part of the EU into Northern Ireland, because Northern Ireland, with the EU, was a very important actor into the Northern Irish process, although the US has been dominated media in that years. After the signature of the Good Friday Agreement, the EU has invested lots of financial and also social resources in the area, not only providing funding the international funds for Northern Ireland, but also facilitating more dialogue between the two communities. So there was a lot of effort on the part of the EU. So the point is that without the EU, Northern Ireland, and also the border counties, which are very close to the border, which were a depressed area, and which has also, of course, ameliorated their way of living and their standards, economic standards, because of the EU, can also lose this important added value. So this is the problem, has several perspectives to be considered.
Indeed. Just before I go, Daniela, I'm curious about the aspect of of all of this, the political aspect of all this, the optics, in fact, I should say, of the politics, the way the public views how things are going between the EU and the UK, right? And just on the point of the EU, within British media, as you may imagine, there are a lot of people who are Brexiteers who are calling out the EU, saying that this was a desperate move, this legal action, this letter, and that in fact the EU is the one that finds itself in a weak position right now, especially because of its handling even of the pandemic. And as you well know, in Italy, where you're sitting right now, that country had a huge outbreak of the virus, and at the beginning, at least in the first instance, it seemed like the EU did not immediately act quick enough to support the country, but now it seems to have done that. I mean, do you think that the EU has been able to prove itself worthy of still being a bloc in a union?
For sure, this pandemic has put the EU in a very difficult situation, which was already very difficult before the pandemic. For sure, the EU has demonstrated to have very weak response capacities towards the pandemic, but it is also clear in this new pact because of the pandemic, but not also because of the pandemic. So it is true that that before the pandemic, Brexit has also demonstrated that the EU could become more, let's say, stronger and try to develop more strength in respect to a country which wanted to leave the EU. But now things are a little bit different. And I think that we can say in the media, not only in the UK debate, which is, of course, the Northern Ireland question is, of course, a very considered and perceived as a very local one. Yeah. So there's no public debate in other countries, for example, because unless you are a scholar like me working on conflict, public opinion is not very well aware of what is happening there. But still, the fact that the US sent a letter to the UK and has just given a few times to reply, which is something that happened to many other countries, and to Italy several times, infringements for different reasons, infringement process, had always been perceived as a sort of demonstration of how the EU would like to control state sovereignty and is against state sovereignty. And this argument has been monopolized and instrumentalized by populist parties in these last months, but now it's going to be, I believe, more instrumentalized. So the fact that the EU is not able to solve problems, but on the contrary, it always asking for doing something. So it's a sort of imposition. So sovereignism, the sovereignism will continue to use that attitude.
Daniela, we'll have to leave there as a final word, but we do sincerely appreciate your time today. That was Daniela Irrera speaking to us there from Messina in Italy, sharing her thoughts with us on this EU legal action against the UK, coming on the heels of the UK passing that legislation about essentially breaking international law, breaking its own deal with the EU, which it had reached vis-a-vis Brexit, of course, over the very sensitive issue of Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, a hard versus soft border there. We'll have to wait and see how that plays out, whether the two sides will really be able to negotiate a final agreement in that regard. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss an open letter which has been written by, and signed by, I should say, in fact, 1,300 academics and lawyers who've called on essentially the world to allow for free speech when it comes to the issue of Palestine. And this all comes and stems from the most latest case of suppression of freedom of speech when it comes to the issue of Palestine in Canada, the University of Toronto. We had Valentina Azarova, who was meant to be coming in as the director of the law school's international human rights program at UFT, the University of Toronto. But that offer was rescinded under pressure from pro-Israel groups because she had worked in the past about Israeli government violations of international law when it comes to the issue of Palestinians in Palestine. Now, of course, there is uproar, which makes sense. There should be uproar about such an issue. Why can't somebody very legitimately look into Israeli government violations of human rights if that has in fact taken place? Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by John Philpot, who is an international lawyer. He's a defense attorney in international criminal law based in Montreal. He's active in Palestinian support organizations as well as the peace movement. We're also joined by Dr. Adnan Husain, who is the director of the School of Religion. He's also an associate professor of medieval Mediterranean and the Islamic world at Queen's University. He's joining us this morning from Kingston, Ontario. Adnan and John, good morning to you both, and thank you for joining us. Adnan, let me start with you. What do you make of this open letter? How important was it to have this come out there, especially after the case of Azarova?
Well, thank you very much for having me on this program to talk about a very important and significant issue when it comes to academic freedom and the cause and struggle for justice and equality. I think it's a very important petition. It's been signed by numerous lawyers and academics and scholars who are outraged that a colleague of theirs, Dr. Valentina Azarova, would be denied an academic appointment that she was offered because of pressure as a result of her legitimate research work for international organizations and academic research that detailed and documented various violations of international human rights law in Israel with regards to the Palestinians. So it's increasingly been clear that pro-Israeli groups have identified university campuses as sites where troubling information and perspectives have circulated, and that students and faculty have this space to be able to discuss serious global issues and are coming to conclusions that undermine Israel's claims as the only democracy in the Middle East and so forth on the international stage, when there is clear documentation of violations of numerous UN resolutions and principles of international human rights law. Right. So this was a very important step to say that colleagues support their colleague and are asking their administrators not to buckle to external forces and pressure that would shut down academic freedom and the possibility for genuine academic research and the search for truth on university campuses.
John, what are your thoughts about this? Because it's not like Valentina Azarova's, research into this was, completely just blindly pro-Palestinian, right? This was based on facts and figures on the ground, and it was done in a balanced, very authentic fashion. Why would this rattle anybody to the extent that, her offer for such an important position at U of T would be rescinded?
Well, ironically, I went to U of T a few years ago, a fair number of years ago, and I lived in residence right behind the law faculty. Now, University of Toronto is a bastion of the Canadian establishment. It's one of the oldest universities, not the oldest, one of the oldest. And universities are places of discussion, of opening people's eyes to different points of view on the world. I went through it myself. I was a student in mathematics, and I learned about the Vietnam War and about politics in the late 60s. And the life in the university is central to the development of points of view which are not necessarily in agreement with government or establishment policy. So when academics and lawyers protest this terrible influence by a judge from a tax court who actually, I understand, his family financed the law school and the University of Toronto. This is a shocking thing, and it shows the subservience of our institutions to Canadian I would call Canadian foreign policy and U.S. foreign policy because it's very close to the U.S. policy. And so this is really a big problem.
During my time in Toronto, I know that there were places in Toronto, especially university campuses such as U of T and especially York as well, where even pro-Palestine protests were suppressed often, and there was often violence from the other side sometimes when such protests were carried out. I mean, again, as both of you have alluded to, university campuses are meant to be places of free speech, free exchange of ideas, and in a calm fashion, of course, we would all hope, but nevertheless, even if it is done in a heated fashion, not be done violently. Do you think that this sort of thing just goes completely against that, A, and then B, that it's not really going to, completely stop the truth, quote unquote, from coming out anyhow? I mean, people who want to get to the truth will find ways to do it anyways, won't they?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Now with social media and with people being able to share information around the world, there are many avenues for us to learn about the truth, what's happening all around the world. However, the difference is that on a university campus, you're supposed to be able to have serious and thoughtful investigation of issues and to be able to debate many sides of an issue. What's become a very troubling pattern is how frequently external groups are trying to suppress that process. This isn't the first time this has happened. You alluded to issues in other parts of the university environment in Toronto. For example, earlier this year, at a conference that I helped sponsor and organize called Becoming Allies, Muslims and Jews Facing Antisemitism and Islamophobia. It was a conference that invited two speakers, a Palestinian scholar and academic and a Jewish academic, to begin our discussion with a number of academics, scholars, and writers to talk about how Muslims and Jews could face common problems of Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, religious and racial bigotry. But because of the particular speakers and because they were going to be critical of Israel's policies, its government policies in the occupied territories in Palestine, there was pressure even from mainstream Jewish communities that wanted to suppress this conference and complain to the university. Faisal Baba, who is another lawyer and in fact sat on the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal, participated in a debate, an academic debate, on an important resolution, a Bill 168 that has come before the Ontario legislature that wants to adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's working definition of anti-Semitism as law in Ontario. Yeah. He was debating against adopting that, and for some of the comments that he made in this, he has come under a great deal of pressure, and he has had a reprimand from his university that has not come out and supported him, but has buckled in some sense to the pressure coming from outside forces that have a political agenda and are unwilling to accept the outcomes of academic inquiry. In fact, they're frightened by academic inquiry and want to suppress it. Because it tells a very different critical story than the one they want to promote.
And I'm glad Adnan brought up the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, right? Because that essentially equates criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. And certainly no one on any side would agree with any form of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, or any such hatred or prejudice. But criticism of Israel cannot and should not be put into that same box, should it?
Of course not. And I reread it prior to this interview, and when you say that claiming the state of Israel is a racist endeavor, we can look back at the Balfour Declaration, which gave Israel, British imperialists gave Israel a national state and did not protect the national rights of the people living there, which were the Palestinians, of course. They didn't say it in those words. Now, this prevents us from discussing all the issues in Palestine and in what we're now calling Western Asia, which used to be called the Middle East. And so this definition is prevalent in the West, in the Anglo world, I think, and it's a way to muzzle all criticism of Western Anglo-Zionist foreign policy in Western Asia, which is, we can all see, one of the hotspots in the world, which could ignite even more important world war or broad conflagration, even although what's going on right now is a gross injustice and wrong on every front. It is war, it is occupation, it is colonialism, and these are things which the Second World War was supposed to put an end to.
Indeed. So Adnan, when we're talking about how does one then take this sort of conversation forward, right? Because it's also ironic, is it not, that on the one hand, we say that sure, Israel is the only, or that at least that's the narrative, that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, and that's, touted and applauded across the board in many quarters. But then at the same time, democracy seemingly doesn't stretch to free speech or criticism of it. I mean, that sort of defies logic. I mean, how does one then convince that this is fine, a democratic state, but at the same time it's a democratic state that seemingly is above criticism? How does that work?
Well, it's an obvious contradiction that is not possible to sustain logically. I think its real effort and its real consequence, however, rather tragically, is to redirect attention away from actual upsurges in anti-Semitism that we are seeing stemming from far-right extremist, ultranationalist movements globally, but especially in Europe and North America. There really is a problem of anti-Semitism. And in fact, we need to stand in solidarity with Jews, with Black people, with indigenous people, and with Muslims and Arabs who are all suffering racism, religious and racial bigotry, and this consequence of conflating criticism of Israeli policies in Palestine with anti-Semitism. One of the dangerous consequences of this is that it fragments what should be natural alliances against the increasing upsurge in white supremacist racism and bigotry. So, for example, the real anti-Semitism that has had violent consequences is this extreme right-wing form of it. So the massacre that took place at the synagogue in Pittsburgh, the Tree of Life Synagogue. What's interesting about that episode, in addition to the fact that it was a right-wing sort of form of violence and activism, was that one of the problems, that these far-right white supremacists have with Jews, and that's the source of their anti-Semitism, is partly because they also blame them for facilitating immigration of refugees and resettlement of refugees into the United States and so on. So the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which is a group that was established and began operations to deal with the Jewish refugee problem that emerged out of World War II, had a global sort of mission and is now standing in solidarity with the 50 million refugees that have been created principally, we have to acknowledge, not only by climate change, but also by the U.S.'s wars in the Middle East and Islamic world that have produced so many refugees. So they blamed this community because they had an active chapter of the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. And what this should remind us is that, in fact, actually, we should be in alliance with one another and in solidarity with one another against any form of racism, bigotry, and so on. And to conflate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism does a deep disservice to our standing up for Palestinian human rights and rejecting racism, colonialism, and bigotry in all its forms. We have to be consistent.
Indeed. And that's a very good point, isn't it? Because, there have been surveys after surveys, at least about American Jews. I'm not sure if there have been such surveys about Canadian Jews, but about how there is sort of this now disconnect on their part, right, where a lot of them in the United States are realizing, of course, not all, but a lot of them are realizing that possibly the policies on the ground there in the territories is not actually something that they want to sign on to and agree with. And we also have we always have important Jewish voices supporting the Palestinian cause and calling for a just resolution to that issue. I mean, I've interviewed Jewish Voice for Peace, leaders all the time on my show. What does that say? Because I would imagine that this entire discussion, this immediate default to anti-Semitism is meant to, in fact, divide, right, and ensure that Jews don't come into the fold when we're talking about Palestine?
I think that's an important factor. In Canada, Canadian foreign policy has been consistently pro-Zionist since 1940, since the Nakba, and even to a certain extent before the actual adoption of the state of Israel. But we, in Canada, as you know, there's Independent Jewish Voices, which is very critical of Zionism and is playing an important role in the pro-Palestinian movement here in Canada. And this definition, which is a way to muzzle us, as I just pointed out, will muzzle Jews, non-Jews, Muslims, anti-Zionist Canadians like myself. And the tendency in the world is resistance to not only Zionism, but other forms of imperialism. And the minority is the resistance. And this definition is designed to weaken the resolve of us in the home countries, the dominating countries, to support the oppressed outside, as is our duty. And I agree with Adnan that we have to try and make alliances with the Jews who suffer discrimination and talk about Israel as it is.
Yeah.
It's not a democracy. Now is purely an ethnic state now. They've decided that officially as of, I think, 2 years ago. Thank you.
Yep, we'll have to leave it there as our final comment, but we do sincerely appreciate both John and Adnan for their time this morning. I know it's early there, but we appreciate their taking the time out of their busy schedules to share their thoughts with us. You know, there's sort of an open letter by 1,300 academics, you know, raising the alarm essentially about what's happening on university campuses, such as the University of Toronto in Canada. And it's not the only such example. We've had several such examples over the past years. Again, no one's calling for free speech to be curtailed on either side, right? It's about having those discussions in the open, especially on campuses, which are meant to be the very bastions of this sort of debate in a calm, of course, and respectful and collective fashion. And then the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, troubling because you cannot automatically equate all criticism of Israel to anti-Semitism. That sort of automatic equal sign between those two is troubling, and that stifles the freedom of speech, especially for an entity that calls itself a democracy or the only democracy in the Middle East. I mean, if you want to hold up that flag and claim that as your own, then you have to live by it too. It's a democratic principle to have free speech. It's a democratic principle to allow for criticism of your policies, whether you agree with it or not. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, and we cannot do the show without talking about Donald Trump's coronavirus diagnosis. He is currently hospitalized, as we've understood, in Walter Reed Military Hospital. What does that mean? Is it serious or not? Donald Trump did upload a video online to his account right before he was transported to that hospital. The diagnosis itself coming as a shock to many, especially this close to the elections, which are just about a month or so away. His wife, Melania Trump, the First Lady of the United States, also positive for coronavirus, as well as other important members of Trump's staff, both former and present as well. Let's discuss all of that a bit further, as well as, of course, the impact of this, possibly, if there will be one, on the elections that are set to come in just a month's time or so. We're now joined by Dr. Robert E. Koulish, who is Director of MLaw Programs, College of Behavioral and Social Sciences. He's a Joel J. Feller Research Professor at the University of Maryland. He's joining us this morning from Baltimore in Maryland. Robert, thank you for your time this morning. What was your first reaction to Donald Trump, of course, getting the virus, in the sense that, this is a president who has downplayed the virus. Of course, everyone wishes him well, but in the sense of his handling of the pandemic so far, many people, online were sort of unsure about how to even react to this news.
Yes, thank you, Waqar. It's an honor to be here. I found out about it at 2 a.m, not last night, but the night before. And I was fortunate enough to fall back asleep. And it really became real yesterday morning. I think that in the U.S., people are exhausted. And this adds another layer of anxiety in terms of what the next 30 days are going to look like for the election. So we have our President of the United States, who has downplayed, as you said, COVID-19 for the last several months, since March, and even mocking his opponent during the debates last Tuesday for wearing a mask. And now we hear not only has he and his wife contracted COVID-19, but several members of his advising staff and members of the Senate who have been with the president on Air Force One as he has been traveling to different events. So I think that we're trying to process what's going to go on. This adds another layer of chaos to an already very, very chaotic election that's kind of unprecedented in the history of this country. It's just difficult to know how to talk about it. We could try to sketch out different scenarios of what's going to happen over the next 30 days, but it's really difficult to know with any certainty what this is going to mean for the future of the campaign.
Robert, I imagine that on both sides, as you said, of course, everyone's trying to guess how this will impact either candidate politically. But right now, do you think that there is some soul searching, some self-reflection going on possibly within the Republican Party?
I think that, yes, there are people in the Republican Party that are have an added layer of concern about what's going to transpire over the next 30 days. I do think that the party is scared in terms of down ballot races. I think that the president has been trying to avoid talking about COVID and talking in terms of this being in the past tense. And now with him having COVID and being in a Walter Reed Medical Center for the next several days, all focus is going to be on coronavirus and COVID-19, which goes against the president's message. I think the issue for Republicans is that this may indeed switch the Senate into Democratic hands. It may add more votes for the in the House of Representatives for the Democratic Party. And I think that it's also going to have an impact on Republicans running down ballot.
There was also conversation a lot. I was watching, a lot of American media this morning before coming to work, and there was a lot of talk about how the Democrats also need to be very careful about how they move forward, because they can't be seen to be, for lack of a better word, mocking the president now, because, and that hasn't happened, at least to the best of my knowledge so far, on the part of Biden or anybody of significance within his campaign. But nevertheless, they need to tread very carefully going forward, because for the American people too, at this point in time, this would be seen as very sensitive territory. Whether or not we agree with him or not, he is the president of the United States. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, he is the president of the United States. Everybody wishes him well personally. I do think that politically this is a very precarious moment for the Democratic Party. From everything I've read and heard over the last 24 hours, the Biden campaign is handling this quite well. They've pulled negative ads. They have issued tweets and statements wishing the president well. This goes to former President Obama, as well as Joe Biden and other people running for office. Speaker Pelosi made a very gracious statement. So, yeah, the Democrats have to thread a needle here where the campaign has to continue given the limited amount of time left, 30 days, and you don't know how the Republican Party and the president are going to turn this or use this in the remaining 30 days. So I think the Democratic Party has to remain vigilant. At the same time, they have to make their case based upon the president's record. But of course, they need to be empathetic, which I think many people are showing empathy publicly for the president's health as a human being. Now, in terms of being commander in chief, I think it's very important, and everybody is quite supportive of maintaining consistency and showing support for the president during this time. And I think that President Trump has handled the situation well by making a statement yesterday before he went into the office. So the world can see that the U.S. government, the federal government, is still functioning at full levels.
As a final thought before I let you go, then, Robert, just to clarify for me if I've gotten this right, that if, God forbid, he were to be unconscious at some time or unable to fulfill his presidential duties even momentarily or temporarily, that power would then go on to the likes of Mike Pence. What is that possibility? What issues does that possibility raise about Mike Pence himself? Because, a lot's known about him, of course, within the U.S., but outside of the U.S., I think he's still fairly an unknown figure.
Yeah. So under the 25th Amendment, if the president were to go under anesthesia or be incapacitated for a brief amount of time, he can, by notifying Congress, he can pass his powers temporarily over to Mike Pence, and Mike Pence would be acting president during that period of time. That's happened in our not too distant past with President Bush and then President Reagan. So this is something that can happen. We have a process for this to occur in an orderly fashion. Now, if the president were to fall more ill and were he not to voluntarily cede his powers to Pence, under the 25th Amendment, Section 4, there are ways for a majority of the cabinet to make a decision and notify both chambers and Congress that the president is incapacitated, and then powers move over to Mike Pence. Going to your question of what that might mean, hey, look, we don't know for sure, but it would mean that the United States does have an orderly system for the transfer of power. Pence would then be running in the campaign, and he would have to run on his record and the record of the Reagan administration. He was the head of the coronavirus task force, which has failed miserably. And so I think a lot of people would believe that Mike Pence, more of a known quantity within the United States, would probably be a fairly easy opponent for Joe Biden.
Very well. We'll have to leave that as a final thought, but of course we appreciate Robert for taking his time out this morning and sharing his expertise with us on this issue of, Trump's coronavirus diagnosis, what it means, and of course all of us are trying to grapple, understand what this does mean for the rest of us on the outside as well about these elections, because these elections, whether we like it or not, U.S. elections and the U.S. presidency does affect the rest of us around the world too when it comes to foreign policy, even though that remains fairly consistent, as we've seen in the past number of presidents. Also, there's essentially a continuation, except on some major issues like the Iran nuclear deal or others. Does this mean Mike Pence may take over, as I asked Robert there at the end? We don't know that right now. Right now, Donald Trump is doing seemingly okay. He's just under observation at Walter Reed. And we'll have to wait and see how all of this plays out. Nevertheless, there is a tad bit of irony here because he did downplay the coronavirus for this long. That doesn't mean that the rest of us don't wish him well. It just means that we do see the irony in all this, and we can very well call it out as well. I'll leave that as my final thought for today's show. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.